Hello, world history students. This is Mr. Everton coming to you from my lovely home in Crozet, Virginia. And today we're going to talk about how imperialism affected East Asian countries, specifically China and Japan. Imperialism did not just happen in Africa. It also happened in Asia. We're going to talk about China and Japan this time. We'll talk about India next time. And the responses from China and Japan are really interesting in that they are very different. And so that's what I'm asking you to think about as we do these notes. How is China responding differently from Japan, and why is one of these countries way more successful than the other? So let's get started. For a very long time, China had been a unified nation run by a centralized government under an emperor, and for most of its history had a claim to being one of the most powerful countries in the world. The only other real competition was the Islamic world, like the Ottoman Empire, and the Abbasid Caliphate before that. But China is this very powerful country. It's a center of manufacturing and makes all of these trade goods. Remember in an earlier unit 2, we talked about how desperately Europe wanted to get to China so that they could trade, get all this amazing stuff that they had for sale. Yeah. So China knows that it's a big deal. And Great Britain in the, like around 1800, Great Britain says, sends a messenger to China, a diplomatic mission to say, hey, we would like to expand our trade with you. And the Emperor of China, pictured here, the Qianlong Emperor, says, yeah, no, that's funny. You guys are cute. We're not interested. Go away. So Great Britain, being the resilient people that the British are, they decide that they're going to trade with China anyway. And the way they're going to do this is they're going to sell them hard drugs. What you see pictured here is an opium poppy plant, and the poppy plant is where opium comes from. Opium is what opioids are made out of, right? This is 19th century heroin, basically. So they start, and Great Britain has already taken a lot of control of India, and there's a lot of poppies growing in northern India. So Great Britain begins selling lots of opium in China, and it becomes a major problem in Chinese society. All the terrible things that drug abuse does to people starts to happen in China. China is super mad about it. They start destroying the opium. The British are like, you're destroying our property. And the whole thing leads to a series of wars called the Opium Wars. And the Chinese are completely surprised that they are unable to even really compete with the British. The British have a modern navy with steamships with artillery on them. And this is a picture of a British ship blowing up Chinese junks, that's the name of their ship, the Chinese junk, which they'd been using for a long time. And it was completely ineffective in preventing the British from doing what they wanted. And the British forced China to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Nanjing, which established, just really embarrassed China, really reduced China from being a powerful country to being a very weak country. And pretty soon, all the other major imperialist European powers began to carve up China, as you can see on this map, creating what they called spheres of influence, which are places where these European countries could operate the way they wanted to inside China, not really have to worry about Chinese law. They could live according to British law or French or German law or whatever. And they could trade as much as they wanted to and get access to all the goods that China had to offer, and China couldn't really stop them. So this was incredibly embarrassing. China couldn't believe that this had happened, and they were left with the question, what do we do? How do we respond to this? Now, there were a bunch of peasants who were incredibly angry about this and decided to rebel and try to overthrow the government, which led to a massive civil war called the Taiping Rebellion, killed vast numbers. This is the bloodiest civil war in all of world history. Way worse than the American Civil War, way worse than any European Civil War. Millions of people died, millions of people fled China, and it really weakened the government. So that's the first thing. The Taiping Rebellion was a massive civil war. that came about because peasants were so angry about what had happened that they wanted to get rid of the government, but they couldn't. They failed. So then government officials are like, okay, we have got to modernize and industrialize our country. We've got to start having factories producing silk, and we've got to try to compete with Europeans by doing the things that Europeans have done. And we need to modernize our military. And here you can see some Chinese scholars with some modern weapons like cannons and machine guns that they're trying to, like get China to use. And the Empress of China, her name is Empress Cixi, she doesn't like that. She doesn't go for it. She says, we have a proud Chinese history. We do not need to change the way that we do things. China is still the most powerful country in the world, and we are not going to give in and start copying these Europeans. And, a lot of that is about feelings that, like, if they change China too much, that she's going to lose some of her power. But she ends up losing her power anyway, because what happens is they have something called the Boxer Rebellion, where China, again, they didn't win the Opium Wars, but then they come back in the year like 1900, I think, try to kick out the Europeans, kill a bunch of Europeans, and then the Europeans just like send back armies and defeat them and put the Boxer Rebellion down. So it's a huge failure. The Qing dynasty is overthrown about 10 years later because they didn't industrialize. So that's China. There'll be a lot more on China, like later in the class. We'll talk about how China went from this to being communist, which is another story. But for now, we'll leave China with the fall of the Qing dynasty. Let's talk about Japan. Japan had been isolated from the rest of the world for a couple hundred years. They'd passed laws that said no Europeans were allowed into China. And then in the mid 1850s, I could have you wrong about that, but around that time, the United States Navy sailed to Japan and used, under the threat of force, under the threat of, opening fire, forced Japan to open up their borders and allow the United States to trade with them. So that's really embarrassing, right? And also Japan has seen what happened with China. They saw the Opium Wars. They saw what happened with the Treaty of Nanjing, and they don't want that to happen to them. They've got this leader who's called a shogun, and the shoguns had been ruling China throughout this period, and they've been really successful, and they'd made, China. I've been saying China so much, Japan. They'd been ruling Japan for many years and had made Japan this very stable, prosperous place. But when the Americans come in and force them to open up their borders, the shogun is overthrown, and they bring back the emperor who'd always been there but wasn't really in charge anymore, who was just a figurehead. Well, the Japanese put the emperor back in charge. His name is Meiji, the Emperor Meiji. So they call this the Meiji Restoration. They restore the emperor to being in charge. And you can see the difference between the way that the shogun was dressed and the way that the Meiji Emperor dressed. The Meiji Emperor is dressed in European-style military clothes. That is a clear indication, I hope, of what's going to be different here. The Meiji Emperor quickly begins industrializing China, and he has all of these Japanese officials that he gets on that page with him, and they put out a massive public relations campaign, basically, letting all the Japanese people know, like, all right, we are going to quickly industrialize to make Japan strong and able to compete with Europeans. We'll have a stronger economy and a stronger military, and that way Europe won't be able to tell us what to do, but we're going to stay Japanese. We're going to have our Japanese culture, and we're going to still celebrate all the things that Japan stands for. We're going to keep our religion. We're going to keep our our cultural history in place. We're just going to start mass producing silk in this silk factory that you see here. We're going to start building railroads. And this is incredibly successful, to the point where Japan actually becomes an imperialist country itself. It has this, modern navy now. It uses to beat the country of Russia, shocking everybody in Europe completely. Like, I can't believe Japan was able to beat Russia. They took Korea and colonized it. They took Taiwan away from China, who they defeated in a war, and colonized that. And they began expanding into the Pacific Ocean, which is eventually going to lead to World War II. So Japan and China, very different responses to threats from Europe and imperialism. China was not able to industrialize quickly, and as a result, completely fell apart. And Japan and went the exact opposite way. They industrialized incredibly quickly and rapidly, and were very successful, and made themselves one of the most powerful countries in the world by the middle of the 20th century. So yeah, I think I just answered the AIM question for you. Oops. You're welcome. And we'll talk about India next time. And thanks for watching.